I'm gonna shortly tell you how we started, how it was going, and what lessons I think might be taken from our case for other local archives. So we actually started as a bunch of friends and students, not knowing what exactly we're gonna do. And the first thing was probably a similar step that you're doing right now, that is gather cases, successful cases of other people who done it before us. So the very core of building our method, let's say, we could call it like that, was on sociologists. Many of the people who actually started this archive ended up doing the PhD, so somehow in relation to academia. And the large inspiration was very strong in Łódź, sociological school of biographical method. I think it will be mentioned later on as well. And I see both Annie and Mariusz, we met many times on biographical seminars. This is like a kind of a stronghold of biographical method. And oral histories that were mainly used by historians, mainly used by, at that time, it was 2010, I think, when we started, so really over a decade. We're using the interviews mainly as a source of information. So there were many questions. We knew, having this background also from sociological side, it's not exactly the way we would like to proceed. And the method that we finally is highly inspired by the biographical method, which to those who are not into sociology and qualitative methods is basically focused on how a narrative is being built and all the construction of how a person narrates its life. So we used the method from, say, one context, more academic, but actually what we're doing later on as local activists, and do not mention many of our side projects using these materials as sources, but we mainly use them also like an oral history, so a source of information, not exactly focusing on how they are built. However, what I defend, this maybe from some perspective more difficult approach to use biographical method that I will very briefly and bluntly even explain in a second, is because we believe it's like more vivid and more true to the people's experience, which we would like to collect and see the city and many processes we're researching from a perspective of a person engaged alive, like processing the social reality. So very basically, kind of methodology, please tell me about your life, and you allow them to speak, not interrupt, just give the space for your interlocutor or narrator to build his biography. And there are pretty sophisticated tools on how to analyze it later. However, on this activist level, we usually try to create the situation that the person whom we meet feels comfortable enough, safe with us, that can open and tell their story. That's why most of the people with whom we talk, we try to reach them via someone who they know. So we are not a person from the street, that someone they can build trust on, which actually this kind of reputation is also problematic, as I imagine it can cause a structure, let's say, enrollment to the research we're proceeding. So getting back to the method, after this open, not anyhow interrupted, possibly, moment of the conversation, later we do ask some more specific questions. So the first part is more like biographical open, and the second would be more on the side of oral histories when you ask questions about particular things. Usually we have a list of disposition, which we follow along the interview, depending on what's the topic of the study. For example, if we were interviewing the oldest citizens of Łódź, that was our first project, we are more focused, for example, on getting into and recalling the interwar Lodz of Łódź. Later, when we, for example, were doing interviews with skilled workers that usually were working in 70s, 80s, up to 2000s, of course, this list of disposition was different. So it's also the role of a person who's interviewing to be really focused and follow the talk, what topics are appealing, what might be actually kind of more interesting or maybe there are the moments that that are not included somehow in this narrative that we'd like to get back to later on. In the end, we usually end up with a few hours of interview. The longest interview we met with the person, I think 3 or 4 times, and there was almost 20 hours of the interview. But this is also when we have someone specific, and probably the further meetings are also leaning to oral history more than the biographical method in its, let's say, academic understanding. So maybe to give you kind of the guide from also the workflow and the steps that we usually follow. I think this is simply the most helpful, considering the project and our current meeting. We always make it very clear what for we gathering interviews, why we want to meet with a person. We're trying not to indicate maybe too much the topic. We usually will put it rather broadly. For example, if we are really interested in transition in Łódź, we probably would say that we're interested in how the Łódź was changing over the years, or someone's experience as a worker. We did once, and that was a big mistake. We never ask this opening question about the specific experience. When we did that, we asked people about to tell us their life from the beginning, when they started to work, when they became active workers. And that was absolutely, in a way, misleading. The narratives we got were usually skipping family background, context of the neighborhood. Considering reaching this kind of in-depth urban experience, I would highly recommend to go with just tell me about your life, and even indicating later through the disposition, getting back to the family of origin, neighborhood that someone was raised, and so on. So we always sign the consent to use the interview we have, and we always do it at the very, very end of the process, so that the person has a control over it. If, I don't know, someone will by accident say something about malicious about his aunt, he can later or she can later delete it. So this is the purpose is that if we build the trust, and we want to persuade it like really seriously, to the extent that all materials and all quotes that we use in our work later on is also usually via the consent of the interviewee. So the selection of quotes that, for example, ended in the book, you can find in the links I have sent. Every single quote there was approved by a person who gave it. And I think this is especially important if you want to build a kind of community and a sense of belonging, a sense of trust on building this kind of broader picture of a city and urban experience together. Especially ask about a pretty open consent that would allow also future scholars, future activists to use the interviews. This is like Creative Commons. This is one thing. The second, we never publish the whole interview. We always take quotes, and this is actually a recommendation of Polish Oral History Association. That's the last link. The page is not perfect, but I send it because it's a good platform to see what's happening in Poland around oral histories. But there is kind of an ethic code that I think is nationally, at least in Poland, recognized. And one of the recommendations is to, considering online archives do not publish the whole interview. However, they are available as long as the association exists, the archives exist, which is a separate problem. We can discuss later on what's going to happen with all the data if, I don't know, on some point, all the people engaged in the topographic on a retire. But this is another problem, I think, pretty valid, like how you store your data and how you organize an archive. But I'm not going to go into that at this stage. And I guess it's also a little bit early to discuss it. So in general, after signing this consent, theoretically, the interview is in the archive, so it can be used in the future without a consent. So there is this little paradox, but as long as we are using the stories, we try to be as fair as possible towards the narrator. We usually also ask about some additional materials like photos. We did ask about drawing mental maps, especially in the projects which were somehow located in a certain space, which it might be a pretty interesting case for you. However, that was the project that we're interviewing the oldest citizens of Łódź, and it occurred to be very difficult on a very basic physical condition, very difficult for them to draw because of their hands were already not in the best, let's say, capacity to drawing. And the second, we actually find it very hard to change context from a nice conversation, suddenly some kind of art craft. People really found it hard to switch and draw for us. So that was the only project we tried. The effects, if there were any, were, I think, extremely interesting. And in a way, I regret we never continued this project. The parts that would cover kind of imagined city spaces and neighborhoods and so on. However, our experience was not very optimistic, and later on we also focused on a little different groups. So the mental maps were not so important for us. This topographical level was not that crucial. What else I would find the most important things? Lately, we were also thinking about conducting generational or family interviews, which means that either we talk with more than one person about the family history, and I would prefer this method to talk with a few members of the same family, trying to reconstruct also kind of generational family history. And this is also, I think, pretty interesting way to reach the neighborhoods, trace how they developed, and so on. I think also the few things that are more important and maybe interesting than we often assume is also the workflow, how we control who's doing interview with whom, what's the status of the interview, is this transcribed, because usually we try to have every interview also transcribed and stored as a recording and as a text. How do we store the data? Again, this is a question about how do we build the archive, what kind of data are in the archive. How do we also proceed RODO, which is a question that appeared pretty lately, but it is really important. And I think also many small local NGOs do struggle with that. This is a kind of interesting but complicated area of expertise. What else? I hope there will be also more questions on the process later on. However, a few insights that I would also like to give based on the experience of class, topographical and generational differences. A very practical kind of conclusion of our over a decade experience is to really focus on older participants, because time pass by and those are the most precious histories we can gather if we were interested in the neighborhood or this kind of topographical dimension. Another thing, it's really much more difficult to reach and later, let's say, execute interview actually happening with people of, let's say, more modest or lower background. So we find especially difficult talking with on the project with craftsmen, sorry for pronunciation, with the extincting professions. So the people who usually were already in the pension years, devoted whole their career usually to one profession. That's how we reach them. Of course, the definition of with whom we want to talk determines with whom we're talking in the end. It appeared to be extremely difficult to let's say, make them to fall into the narrative, to start this a very freely spoken part of their life. Usually it ended up with more like oral history mode, so particular questions, very concrete, and sometimes after a few they managed to open and speak freely, but usually there were pretty short interviews. And of course it also depends on who was talking to them, but that is one of the most challenging projects. And shared doing interviews with unskilled production workers from textile industry. It was also more difficult to build this free part of the interview without the questions. And they were all, this also has a lot to do with gender, because of the textile industry. As you can imagine, many of those were women who usually would refer us to skilled workers, mainly men, saying that they have nothing to talk about and the experience is unimportant. And I think this is precisely the mission of this activism and also academic mission, let's call it, to reach these groups that otherwise would be very difficult to find their representation in a public discourse. In contrast, for example, interviews with professor that also resulted in another book appeared to be extremely challenging at the phase of authorization, because every word had to be checked twice, and those are people who, as we know, work with language and want to control it. So I guess this is also predicting the challenges that might develop depending on which group you want to focus. I see this 1 minute and maybe kind of the closing remarks. I hope we might open some cooperation in the future and share the experience with you. If you have any particular questions or wanna reach us later on, please write me an email and I try to follow up with you.